Hello everybody and welcome back to more of our player guide series. My name is Zen and I'm going to be walking you through another one of our beginner guides. Today we're talking about gear, and gear is something that is fairly complex within Star Wars. Now I'm not going to be talking about where you get gear or where you get certain types of gear, but I will be telling you how the gear is typically sorted out and how you actually are able to deal with it within the game. And in Star Wars in particular, it's one of those things that once you understand it, you'll get it from then on. But if you're a new player coming into the game, there's a lot of concepts here that haven't really been used by other games quite yet, so it's new to a lot of people. Now, of course, the first thing to talk about is the quality of gear, the color of the gear, basically, when you look at it as an item. And this is something that typical RPGs do nowadays, where if an item is really good, it'll have a different color on the name rather than if it is really bad. So that is something that's pretty common in MMOs. However, the way Star Wars does it gets a little complicated towards the end. And the first thing we have is the gray gear, right? So this is the cheap gear. This is the gear that is pretty much crap and you're meant to sell it. Then after that comes the white, which is called standard within the game. This can be several different types of items. However, more commonly it is also just vendor trash. Then you have green, which is called premium. That's when you're starting to get into an item that actually is worth some kind of value, whether it's a consumable item or a piece of gear that you're actually going to equip. Then you have blue, which is prototype. That is getting much better in quality of items. Then purple, which is artifact. You got to get your purples. This is basically the same concept as World of Warcraft, where the purple items are typically the best items. There are a few exceptions. And then on Star Wars, you have dark purple, and this is something that you won't really see all that often, but it is the legendary is what it is, and that's what they call it in the game as well. Now, with the legendary items, it's different than the normal purples, which is artifact. So they have only made a couple within the game, and you can usually find them on like old stuff, like the old bowcasters they put out for a event way back in the day. It was basically the Grand Acquisitions race. It was a race event, and you could get this bowcaster, and in it had some mods, and we'll talk about mods in a second, but those were dark purple, and you don't really see them outside of kind of odd items like that, so don't expect to see them all that often. The main misconception here is that the next quality of item, which is orange for Star Wars, is the legendary, and a lot of people think that that's what it is when they first come into the game, because that's what Warcraft does, that's what a lot of other games do. But in Star Wars, orange means something completely different entirely, and that's actually what really changes the way Star Wars does loot. So orange gear is called custom gear, right? So this can be many different things, because you can find custom gear in dark purple, blue, even green gear, But what this means, what custom means, is that you can remove certain parts of the gear and place in other parts. So you can kind of keep a piece of gear that you like the look of for quite a long time and just replace the stats on it. So you're constantly getting the stats that are more beneficial as your level, right? But you see this mostly on orange gear. All of orange gear is customizable in some way or another. So that's kind of why it is called custom gear. But the orange gear can also be something called adaptable, which means if it looks like it's heavy armor, the orange custom piece, you can actually take out the armor piece of it and put in a light armor piece, and it would change it to a light armor piece of gear. So say you're an Inquisitor, which you can only use light gear if you're an Inquisitor, and you see a really cool custom piece of armor that says adaptable on it. Now you have to make sure it says adaptable. Then you could take a look of like a bounty hunter or a warrior that are typically using heavy gear, and you could put it on your Inquisitor. This is actually really cool because it allows you to customize the look of your character much more efficiently, and it even gives you a feeling of stat priority. So you're going through all the different stats, you're replacing them with the ones that you want, and it feels like you have more control over your gear, when in reality it's pretty typical for all MMOs to have this. It's just the way that Star Wars does it in particular makes it feel really good. So with that being said, most orange gear is cosmetic, right? So some will come with stats, but most of it is cosmetic, at least the intentions of that piece of gear. And when you buy things like this on the cartel market, it'll usually be an orange piece of gear that is cosmetic, and you just switch it out. Especially if you buy the cartel packs and you get, empty pieces of gear that have no stats on them, but they are orange, so you can pop in the different mods. And we'll talk about mods later in the video, but there's one more thing about the orange customizable gear that we have to mention, which is it can also have a very particular tag on it, which is called legacy bound. Some other items in the game can have this, but you see it mostly on certain orange gear, and that just means that if you buy something and it binds to your character, so it makes it so you can't trade it with other people, right? But what it does allow you to do is to send it through the mail system to another one of your characters, and that's what legacy bound means. And it is all tied in with the legacy system, which is something that ties all your characters together on one server, which is really cool, and we'll talk about the legacy system in greater detail in the future. But just know that if something says legacy bound, basically it means you could trade it to another character. So if you get something on your Inquisitor, like I was saying earlier, that you can't actually use on it, say it's a gun, then you could send it to your bounty hunter and they could use it instead, which is actually a really cool system. And normally I would get right into talking about mods and how to actually mod your gear and customize it even further, but the first thing we need to talk about is something we haven't really gone into great detail yet in any of these beginner guides, which are the stats. So the stats are just different things that improve your character within the game. You see this in all RPGs, all gear has certain types of stats. This came from the concept of D&D back in the day, so it's pretty familiar to most people, but the way that Star Wars does stats is it just has different names, basically. So we're going to go over these and you can kind of figure out which one does which. And what you need to know with stats are there are two types of stats within the game. There are primary and secondary. So the primary are the stuff that you usually see on specific character classes. So you have strength, aim, cunning, and willpower. Strength is like warriors, Jedi Knights. Aim is bounty hunters, troopers. Cunning you find on the agent and the smuggler, and then willpower you'll find on the consular and the inquisitor. But there are a couple other primary stats that every class usually shares. So you have endurance. Endurance is anything that basically increases your HP, and that's what endurance does. Presence is very specific. We'll talk about that in a second. And then the last thing you have is expertise. Expertise you'll find mostly in PvP gear. It just affects PvP in the ways that you might imagine, taking less damage and all that nonsense that comes with the PvP stat. Now, expertise is only for PvP. It doesn't really affect PvE at all. So if you have it on a PvE piece of gear and you plan on, doing raid bosses, then it's actually a wasted stat, so you're losing out on stats that you could have otherwise if you have PvP stats on. Now back to presence for a second. Presence is also something that if you're doing PvE with a large group of people, you're not going to get any benefit from it. It is primarily a stat that increases everything your companions do. So if they are to heal you, DPS, or do damage and tank at the same time, stuff like that, presence affects that for your companion specifically. So if you don't have your companion out and you have presence on your gear, not going to make a huge amount of difference, is it? So let's talk quickly about secondary stats as well. So you have accuracy, which is pretty self-explanatory, makes it so you can hit the target easier. If things are higher level than you, or boss mechanics are introduced in a enemy, then typically you have to have higher accuracy in order to hit them. So crit is how you are going to, like, your percentage of crit, and then you have surge, which is how much damage your crit will actually do, which is it's kind of a cool change of mechanic. You don't usually see that in other MMOs. Then you have alacrity. This is usually called haste. It reduces the global cooldown of all your abilities. It reduces the cast time of abilities and the channel time. Usually something that you'll find on characters that have a lot of cast times and of the sort with that. Then you have power. Power can go in two different directions, but you'll usually see it as just power. Now, power increases the damage of abilities that you can use, But specifically, you'll find sometimes that you have tech power and force power. Tech power is stuff, that bounty hunters, agents use, or the force power is something like Sith, they'll use that, or Jedi, they'll use force power. So sometimes you'll see a distinguishing factor there, but most of the time it'll just be a straight power stat, and then it puts itself into one of those two categories based on the class you're playing. And then you have armor. Armor is a primary stat that you'll find on gear, but I consider it a secondary stat. So armor just basically reduces the amount of damage that you're going to take on a given physical hit. Then you have the most tank stats here. You have defense, shield, and absorb. Defense pretty much is avoidance, right? So it helps your chance to avoid certain attacks. Shield, if you have a shield in your offhand and you're a tank, it gives you a chance to shield an attack, right? So that's your shield chance. And then your absorb stat, which is another secondary stat, increases the amount that you will actually shield for. So some tanks work with these stats differently, but for the most part they're pretty much all the same for each of the different tank classes to begin with. Now, there is actually quite a bit of math that is involved with these stats and how they affect your characters, but we're not getting into that because this is a beginner guide. You don't really need to know any of that if you're beginning the game for the first time, right? So you just need to know what the different stats kind of do. So when you run across them, you could be like, oh, that's not for me. I'm not a tank. I don't need shield or absorb. Or you could be like, I'm a DPS. I need more accuracy because I need to actually be able to hit the target to do damage. However, now that we've actually gone through the stats, we can move on to the second bit of gear, which is the mods. Right, you'll find mods in customizable gear, and there's specific types that you'll find in different kinds of gear, but for the most part you'll always find these sets. So for any gear that you'll equip that is like a chest piece or leg plates and stuff, you'll always find armoring, and that's the primary one. Armoring will have a primary and usually, the armor stat, so if you put an armoring in that is a high level armoring, but it matches your levels, so say you're level 55, you put a level 55 armoring in, and it is a really nice one, it'll add a huge amount of armor rating to that piece of gear as if it was the same quality as something else that you would find that doesn't have a customizable stat. I know that's really confusing, but you'll kind of get the hang of it as you go through it. But with armoring, there is something that you do need to know, is when you get into the end game with gear and you're pulling out really good armorings from pieces of gear that would normally drop from like raid bosses, it has a binding on it. So some armorings can only go from a chest piece into another chest piece, so keep that in mind. But for the most part you won't necessarily find that too often in just normal customizable gear. You can put any armoring in whatever gear, just very specific ones, and it will let you know when you pull it out. You can read it, and it will say that it is just a chest piece or bracers or something like that. Then the next major mod you have are called mods, right? It's basically a piece of gear that will typically have two main stats on it and then a secondary stat like accuracy and crit with endurance and aim, so that's what mods are. They can have quite a bit of stats on them and then little bits of each, but for the most part you always find like three major stats on it. Then you have enhancements. Enhancements usually don't have primary stats such as strength, aim, cunning, or willpower, but they usually do have endurance and then a secondary stat. But enhancements don't go in every piece of gear, so keep that in mind when you're kind of looking around. You'll see sometimes enhancements are missing from certain pieces of gear, like belts often, or bracers. You may find a mod and an armoring, but you may not necessarily find an enhancement to put in. There's also another more obscure mod that you'll find in gear, which is the die module. And you won't find it in all gear, but you will find it in some, especially most chest pieces that are customizable. Basically, a die module allows you to change the color of a piece of gear, right? So you have kind of a strange system with the die modules. You have primary and secondary colors. I'm not talking about color wheel colors here, but say you have a die module that the primary color is black and the secondary color is blue. You can get things like that, and then you can put that into a chest piece, say for instance, and it will change the colors of that chest piece to black and blue. There are tertiary colors that you don't really have the option of changing. The chest piece may change it for you, or it'll keep like certain effects the same. But for the most part, you can change, you know, the primary colors on the chest piece. But then the other thing you could do is you could go into the character screen and you can actually set the colors to be bound to your chest piece. So what that means is the rest of your gear will change colors to that chest piece. So you don't have to dye all of your gear, you just have to dye the chest piece. But that's only if you have this option unlocked. And you can only get this option, I think, if you're a subscriber for sure, maybe a preferred player, but I'm pretty sure free-to-play players just don't get it at all. I would suggest checking the GTN and purchasing it. I mean, you could purchase an unlock for fairly cheap on there, or you can just spend a little bit of cartel coins. However, just throwing down a subscription for a month, you might want to use those cartel coins if you really want to get that option to unlock when you go back to pre or preferred or free to play. So that's just one of those things that if you're thinking about dyeing your gear, I would really suggest having that because it actually saves you a lot of money on dye. Now, you can get dye from the GTN because people sell it all over the place there. It's actually really easy to find because it comes from most of the cartel packs. You can also get it from some vendors in the game. And the last thing you can get it from is a little bit of crafting with Artifice. Now, it is probably really important to mention that the dye modules don't add any stats to your gear, it just changes the look of your gear. And then you have the last bits, which are usually found only in weapons or offhands, such as shields. You find hilts, right? Hilts improve the damage of lightsabers or swords or anything like that. Then you have barrels, that's pretty self-explanatory. It's gonna be guns, right? It's gonna improve your gun damage. And then you have color crystals. Color crystals are unique in the fact that they all, if they're around the same level, they all pretty much have the same stats unless they're like a really good quality. But once you hit level 50, from then on, all like crystals that are of the artifact quality will have the same stats on them, so you don't have to worry about that. But what color crystals do is it allows you to change the color of your weapon. And all color crystals will have two colors on them. It'll have a primary color and a secondary color. So if you're looking at a lightsaber, the primary color is on the outside, the secondary color is on the inside, such as like a purple-black or an orange. We'll have just an orange on the back or on the primary and then a white in the middle. Although it is worth noting that guns will also be affected by color crystals, because as you're using the rounds on your guns, the blaster bolts will have the different colors that you would find from the color crystal. And the very last thing that we have to talk about is augmentation and augment kits, right? So if you find an augment, which is another type of mod, you could put it in your gear. However, you have to augment your gear in order to be able to put it in. So augments typically are like a primary stat and then a secondary stat, and you can add it to any piece of gear that you can actually wear. So relics, implants, earpieces, weapons, armor, offhands, anything. You could put an augment in, but you have to have an augmentation kit. Once you have an augmentation kit, you can go to any modification bench. You can find these pretty easily in the fleet, but if you find one, what you do is you click on it and then you put a piece of gear in and then you select add augment slot. But what happens is you have to add an augment slot of equal or greater value than the augment you're putting in. So for example, at the high end we have right now MK9 kits. So if we want to put an MK9 augment into our gear, which is a really good augment, then we have to have an MK9 kit in order to augment our gear to begin with. Otherwise, we won't be able to put the augmentation actually in. And this is more of a high-end stat thing. You really shouldn't mess around with this with lower level gear unless you plan on keeping something for a while, like a custom piece of gear, because then you could just constantly switch out the mods in it and keep upgrading the actual augment within it. But I hope that at least to some degree explained how the gear and quality of gear actually works within Star Wars, because it's really complicated, and this was a long video to actually get that point across. So hopefully you will understand that the orange gear is actually quite valuable as far as customizing your character, because you can just throw in different mods as you level up, and you can keep a look that you really like. And some people really like to do that, but it also means that you can go to the cartel market, find something else that you might like a little bit more, and switch it up a bit, and you can mix and match gear as well, which is really cool. You don't have to just normally stick with the gear that you'll find leveling up. And if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below this video, and I'll try to get back to them as soon as possible. But on that note, we shall see you guys next time.